You have no idea how cool it was being a kid and seeing NBA opening day and Christmas fall on the same day in 2011. I was in middle school when this happened, and with the 2011 lockout preventing us from having NBA basketball for the first 2 months of the 2011-12 season, I was itching for it to be back. And when it was announced that the season opener would be on Christmas Day, along with the matchups and storylines that we were getting, you couldn't tell me it wasn't going to be the greatest Christmas day in NBA history. And looking back on it, it just may have been. My name is Caleb, and happy holidays. I know as sports fans, outside of spending time with family, friends, exchanging gifts, or however you spend time at this point in the year, there's nothing like a full slate of basketball on Christmas Day. And in 2011, we arguably had the most unique lead up and day of basketball during that year's holiday season. It's hard not to get nostalgic about days like that, especially living through it as a kid. Today, we're going to revisit the NBA's opening day on Christmas 2011, the lockout that prevented the season from starting on time, the games and the storylines that made up the Christmas Day schedule, and what made that year's slate so special. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this, and with that being said, let's jump in. It was weird not having NBA basketball start on time in late October 2011. When the lockout started in July, it was far enough from the start of the season that the new CBA could be resolved over the next few months before play began. But July 1st became August, and come September, the NBA canceled training camp and the beginning of the preseason. It was cutting it kinda close, but there was still time for the players' union and the owners to come to an agreement. But once the remainder of the preseason and every game through November got canceled, no one was really sure when the NBA would actually begin play. So a lot of the players who were left with no hoops for months and access to their team's facilities would find work elsewhere. In the meantime, a lot of the players were playing in some of the best Pro-Am leagues around the country. Summertime is typically peak Pro-Am season, as famous leagues like the Drew League, or even more recent league like Jamal Crawford's Crossover in Seattle, give NBA players some fairly elite runs during the off-season. But in 2011, Pro-Am season extended into late summer and early fall. We saw guys like Carmelo Anthony, Kevin Durant, and even LeBron playing what were essentially high school gyms in these organized leagues where they would obviously be the best players there by far. This alternative was something that was sweeping the league during the lockout, as a lot of these players would end up playing in the same Pro-Am leagues together. And if NBA players weren't hooping in Pro-Ams or charity games stateside, there was a good amount that took their talents overseas as they waited for the season to start. A lot of players who went overseas would sign one-year deals or deals that allowed them to end their contract once their NBA duties resumed. Even all-star level players would find themselves going home to play for their home countries. Like Tony Parker would go home and play in France, where he hadn't played professionally since he was a teenager. After almost 5 months and different periods of non-negotiations, negotiations, and a handful of offers that fell through, the players and owners would finally come to an agreement on a new CBA, and the season was back on. As a kid watching this all go down, you don't really understand it all, but all I knew was that basketball was coming back. The lockout might deserve a video of its own one day just to go more in depth, we'll see. But the league was going to play a 66 game schedule, with the rest of the year being what we were accustomed to before, except for more back-to-backs to be able to fit that many games before the playoffs started in April. Opening day was going to be on December 25th, and the NBA couldn't have scheduled 5 better matchups at the time. Going into Christmas, these games truly had it all to make for an all-time NBA Christmas Day. I knew from the jump it was going to be one of my favorite Christmases ever, because out of everything I asked for that year, there was one thing that I was looking forward to under the tree, and it was getting NBA 2K12 with Magic Johnson on the cover. It was going to be a great way to celebrate the NBA starting that day, and I had time to at least build my MyPlayer and get a couple games in before the first game started at noon. It's funny how the lockout also affected the game that year in really specific ways too. Like the 2011 draft class just wasn't in the game at all, so all the rookies had to wait for their video game debut until 2K updated the game. And it's not hard to forget that the vibe around NBA Christmas back then was a little different than it was now. There were still holiday signifiers on uniforms, and in 2011, it was the snowflake over the NBA patch over the shoulder. It was something small that year, but it was still cool to at least have something to signify the holiday, and I wish Nike would follow in Adidas' footsteps and bring back the Christmas uniforms. But the 2011-12 season debut would come at noon, and as always, on Christmas Day, we'd start the slate in Madison Square Garden in New York City. A re-energized New York, I might add. This was the best Knicks team in who knows how long. Carmelo Anthony was going into his first full season as a Knick after joining forces with Amari Stoudemire, and adding Tyson Chandler fresh off his championship championship run in Dallas, where he anchored the middle as the team's starting center. It was a first-round rematch from the season before, as they'd been swept by the now older Big Three Boston Celtics. Despite Rajon Rondo coming into his own as a fourth All-Star on the team, the Celtics were beginning to look vulnerable at this point, and this was probably going to be their last crack at another championship run with this core. They themselves were coming off a gentleman's sweep to the Heat in the second round of that year's playoffs, but were still one of the best teams in the NBA and matched up with the new-look Knicks pretty well. Paul Pierce would be out this game with a heel injury, which meant they were going to need scoring elsewhere. Basketball being a game of runs was exemplified by this game specifically, as at one point or another, both teams led by double digits. These were the type of games that Melo was built for, because he had 37 with 20 of them coming in the fourth, as no one that Boston threw at him could stop him. Rondo would pick up the scoring slack for Boston and would score an almost career-high 31 points along with his 13 assists. The Knicks held a 2-point lead with a few seconds left, and Boston would put the ball in Kevin Garnett's hands. He'd get to his spot and get off a good look at a 17-footer, but he missed the mark, and the Knicks would escape with an opening day W in the Garden. Revenge is sweet sometimes, and it was kind of a theme throughout the first couple games of the day. As things were wrapping up in NYC, the Mavs were raising a championship banner in the faces of the team they beat to get it just 6 months earlier. Game 2 of the 2011 Christmas slate was the Miami Heat in Dallas to take on the Mavs, and this game had so many implications coming into it. It felt like the greater good had won that previous season. The villainous Big Three Heat lost in the NBA Finals in relatively embarrassing fashion, and LeBron had his worst NBA performances on the biggest stage. Dirk, after losing to the Heat in the Finals 5 years earlier, got his revenge and won his first championship with his first Finals MVP. It was truly a storybook ending to that season for a lot of fans, and for the Mavs to receive their rings in front of the team who they just beat, it was only salt in the wound for Miami, who was returning most of the same roster. Dallas had a few changes in the lineup, including the recently departed Tyson Chandler, who left a hole in their defense now that he was gone. But if the Heat used that ring ceremony on Christmas for anything, it was strictly motivation. They came out blazing with a 32-17 lead at the end of the first quarter, as LeBron would make it known that his 2011 Finals performance was a fluke. Dallas was held to 37% shooting the entire game and a very cold 32% from 3. The final score of 105-94 made the game seem a little closer than it really was, but LeBron and D Wade would remind the world that they were the best duo in the NBA and one of the best in league history. Bron and Wade would have 37 and 26 respectively to start the season on a high note and start their road to redemption for a championship in June. And across the country in LA, we had two teams that were kind of heading in the opposite direction. The Bulls, with the gritty team that valued defense more than most, along with the youngest MVP in NBA history, were coming off an Eastern Conference Finals appearance and were looking to take that next step. The Lakers were aging, coming off an embarrassing sweep to the eventual champions, but still had two future Hall of Famers and one of the greatest players ever. Not to mention Mike Brown was the most recent Lakers coach to don the purple and gold, and it was going to be interesting to see how his basketball philosophy would mesh with a player like Kobe's. And to start, the Lakers and Bulls began the season in a gritty, low-scoring game. The Bulls' defense picked up right where it left off from the season before, forcing 14 Lakers turnovers, but they were not scoring the ball well. On the other hand, the Lakers shot 47% from the field, but were 4 for 16 from 3. It was unsurprising that Kobe was carrying this Lakers offense but wasn't getting much scoring help from his teammates. Each team took turns each frame of the game, taking the lead back and forth from each other, leading to a 1-point Laker lead with just over 20 seconds left and LA in possession of the ball. Metta World Peace inbounded to Kobe, who was immediately swarmed by Joakim Noah and Derrick Rose, who would then turn the ball over to Luol Deng. He swings the ball to Rose, and the youngest MVP in NBA history would go to work. Cleared out against Derek Fisher on the left wing, Rose hits him with a quick cross to get to the paint, shoots a floater over Pau Gasol, and gives the Bulls a lead with just under 5 seconds left. You know where the ball is going if Kobe Bryant is on the other team, and the Lakers need a bucket with little time left. Kobe would get the ball from Metta, drive to the basket, and attract the entire Bulls defense that not only gave birth to this iconic image, but would get blocked by Deng to give the Bulls an 88-87 Christmas Day win. It's always a great NBA Christmas Day when you get an iconic NBA moment during the day, and Rose's game winner versus the Lakers is objectively one of the more notable Christmas Day moments in recent NBA history. Watching two MVP candidates duke it out in LA is always going to draw eyes, but it was becoming increasingly regular to watch MVP level basketball over in OKC as well. The up-and-coming fan favorite Thunder were spending their Christmas at home, taking on Dwight Howard and the new look Magic. The Orlando team that made a run to the finals just 2 years earlier was almost completely gone outside of Dwight, Jameer Nelson, Hedo Turkoglu, and JJ Redick, and it was going to be a true early season test against KD, Russell Westbrook, and James Harden, who were legit finals contenders coming into the 2012 season after a dark horse Western Conference Finals run in 2011. The Magic were reeling after a first-round upset to the Hawks and were wondering whether Dwight Howard would even be in Orlando beyond that year. He requested a trade right after the lockout ended, and wherever he would have ended up if his trade requests were granted would have been a surefire super team. He was still the best center in the NBA at the time and ideally could have been the final piece for a contender somewhere, but for now, he was stuck in Orlando with a roster he felt wasn't equipped to win. The vibes were pretty low on this Orlando team. But in OKC, there could not have been a more hungry team in the NBA, and this Christmas Day showcased the general feeling of both of those teams at this time. Orlando just came out flat and stayed that way pretty much the entire game. Outside of getting solid production from Ryan Anderson and Jameer Nelson, you could tell early on that there was a dark cloud around this Orlando team. With Dwight's future up in the air and him allegedly wanting Stan Van Gundy out as coach, it was not a fun time to be a Magic player. Meanwhile, KD, after a summer a hooper could only dream of after dominating parks and pro-am leagues all across the country, carried the offensive load and put up a cool Christmas Day 30 as he started his quest for another scoring title and a possible run to the finals. This was one of the few NBA Christmas days where we had at least one contender in every single game, and in the final game of the night, we had some of the most exciting players in the game wrap up the NBA's opening day in Oakland. Chris Paul was making his LA debut as a Clipper, when just a few weeks earlier, he was briefly and unofficially a Laker. Just as the lockout ended, CP3 was traded to the Lakers in a 3-team deal on December 8th, but the trade was blocked by David Stern as the Hornets were owned by the league at the time. But despite not being able to team up with Kobe, Chris Paul was still on the trade market, and New Orleans would send him to LA's other team just 2 weeks before the season started. The Clippers hadn't had much to cheer for in a while, or maybe ever depending on who you ask, but the arrival of Chris Paul would change the trajectory of the franchise alongside a young Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan. Their Christmas and opening day opponent Warriors also hadn't had much to cheer for since really the We Believe era. A pre-dynasty Warriors is so interesting to look at because in 2011, Steph was still dealing with reoccurring ankle injuries, people were still undecided on whether Monte Ellis or Curry could lead this team into the future, Klay was a rookie, David Lee was arguably their best player, and Draymond was still at Michigan State. This team was coming off another season where they had missed the playoffs and had just hired Mark Jackson as their head coach, and to start the season at least, it was looking like more of the same for the Warriors. In what would end up being a 19-point loss, their young guards in Curry and Ellis would struggle, shooting a combined 8 for 31 from the field for 19 points. David Lee would carry the offensive load for 21 and 12, but it was clear that this team was just not there yet. Klay would also make his NBA debut in this game as he'd score 8 off the bench in 19 minutes. They would keep it close throughout the game, but Chris Paul's late fourth quarter takeover helped the Clippers pull away. They'd end the game on a 14-2 run, and for the Clippers, the Lob City era was ushered in on this night. LA actually looked great and were working on convincing the rest of the league that these weren't the same old Clippers we had come to know. Chris Paul immediately became a culture changer to helm one of the most fun teams in the league, and Blake Griffin led all scorers that night with 22. So despite the lockout and missing the first 2 months of the season, what we got to open the 2012 season with on Christmas Day was something that I won't forget anytime soon. We got to witness some of the greatest players ever go to battle on opening day during a holiday at some of the most important stages of their career. And as we get further from 2011, some of these players and storylines are still prevalent today in a few different ways, which is really cool to see. I'm almost positive that we'll never have another major sports league in the US start on a major holiday like we saw then, so it was truly fun to witness this slate of games 13 years ago. And it was also fun going back and briefly revisiting these games and the stories leading into them, so let me know your favorite NBA Christmas Day memories in the comments. My name is Caleb. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe. Happy holidays, and I'll catch you on the next one.